The morning began as always, soft light filtering through the curtains, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, the rustling of paper in my hands. As usual, I woke before dawn, immediately feeling the familiar light fatigue that quickly faded with the first sip of coffee. The entire routine, requiring no special thoughts, unfolded with unwavering precision. Everything was just as it should be, reliable and calm. I dressed in my usual office outfit, a dark suit, a white shirt, and formal shoes. It seemed I could live like this for the rest of my days, without any significant changes. Today, I planned to spend the day at home, tidying up the old basement, the library I rarely visited. The place was sacred to me, filled with many old books, forgotten notes, and archives that held memories of my past. I had always tried to keep it in order, but each visit became more and more strange, as if with each passing year it had become part of another time. Today, I will take care of it, I said to myself as I descended the stairs to the basement. I hadn't realized how quickly a year had passed since the last time I reviewed anything there. A powerful sense of nostalgia washed over me as I entered the room. The air was damp, a little musty, and it carried the smell of age. Not immediately realizing what it was, I carefully pulled at an object. It was an ornament, something ancient, intricate in its form. Remembering how I had received it as a gift at the age of 16, I felt a strange wave of memories rush over me. But these memories were not just warm or pleasant. I had hidden it, and something about this object, perhaps the fact that I had forgotten it, filled me with unease. Why had I put it there? Why had I not told anyone? And just at that moment, as I was almost able to make out the object in my hands, I heard footsteps. Someone's footsteps, confident enough for me to immediately recognize Ben, John's son. He had come home earlier than I had expected. "What are you doing here?" I asked, although I immediately realized it sounded somewhat absurd. Ben, with his characteristic casual smile, was standing in the doorway, watching me. There was nothing suspicious in his gaze, but I still felt the tension fill the room. For some reason, I didn't want him to see this. Something about his presence made me feel uneasy. I quickly hid the object back in the box and tried to restore everything to order, but every movement seemed too sharp, as if I were trying to hide something important. "You're always tidying something up, nothing surprising," Ben said, his voice so calm that I even felt a little reassured. But when he didn't leave, instead staying there, I felt that strange coldness again. I looked at him and noticed how his eyes, though relaxed, were carefully studying every movement I made. When he finally spoke, his words were carefree, almost ironic, as always. "You need to rest more. You worry too much. Everything's fine." It was one of those typical phrases that didn't require a response, but somehow in his mouth, they didn't sound the same as usual. I felt the weight of his gaze hanging over me, and the simplicity with which he said it seemed unsettling. I waited a few seconds to calm myself, and then realized that perhaps I just needed to continue doing what I had planned. But in my mind, thoughts kept swirling about how something invisible had arisen between us, something I couldn't understand. And every time Ben was near, that feeling grew stronger, as if his presence filled the space around me, making me feel out of place. "Are you looking for something?" His voice broke through my thoughts again. I nodded, trying to smile, but I knew that everything he had said had already made me feel uncomfortable. After that incident, I tried to return to my usual routine. All I needed to do was prepare dinner, set the table, and spend the evening with John, just like in the past few years. Nothing difficult, just ordinary family matters. However, at some point, I realized that thoughts of Ben were starting to break through, preventing me from focusing on what I was doing. It was like an intrusive feeling that wouldn't let go. I stood at the stove, chopping vegetables, and time and again felt his gaze like an invisible weight in the air. I couldn't understand why, but Ben no longer seemed the same. His behavior had become persistent, his words slightly strange, as though he was beginning to see something in me that I didn't see in myself. His presence in the house had become more noticeable. When he was around, his glances didn't just slide over me, they seemed like they were trying to penetrate deeper into some invisible layers of my consciousness. "You always worry too much, haven't you noticed that?" His words hit like a hammer, and I felt an odd unease take hold of me. How many times had I told myself to relax, not be so strict? But now his question seemed not just a remark, but an accusation. There was no reproach in his voice, but his gaze held an insistence, something new that made me feel out of place. I tried to remain calm and focus on preparing dinner, but every gesture of his, every glance, seemed to disturb my peace. He stood nearby, not turning away, watching every move I made. At some point, it began to feel like he wasn't just observing, but searching for something, understanding something that I wasn't aware of myself. I felt my body react to his proximity, the same cold I couldn't explain lodged in my chest. I looked away and quickly returned to chopping vegetables, trying to regain control. But each time I met his gaze, it became harder to maintain the appearance of calm. It was as if he could read me, and at some point I realized that his attention had become so intense that I could no longer remain indifferent. There wasn't a single day when he wasn't nearby. He was increasingly becoming a part of my space, my thoughts, an inseparable detail of what had once seemed harmless and familiar. One evening, while preparing dinner, I noticed that Ben was in the room again. He had entered the kitchen so quietly that I didn't immediately see him. He stood there, in the corner of the room, motionless, as if he were just watching. I could feel his presence, even without seeing him. It was a strange sensation, as if the entire kitchen was filled with his attention. He didn't say a word, but I knew he was there, and it made me nervous. I tried not to pay attention to him, continuing my work. I was chopping meat, stirring the pot, but it all felt foggy. He didn't move. He just watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes weren't just following my hands, but scanning every thought in my mind. For some reason I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't understand what had changed, but his presence had become heavy, like the room itself, filled with his silence. "You always worry so much, haven't you noticed?" His words sounded almost reproachful, as if he knew more about me than I knew myself. I couldn't understand what it was about those words, but they pricked at me like sharp thorns. They exposed some deeply hidden feelings I had been trying to ignore. I could feel myself losing control, as if everything I thought I knew about myself, about our relationship, was beginning to crumble. I kept chopping vegetables, unable to stop this inner struggle. He didn't leave. I could see how his eyes followed my hands, how he evaluated every movement I made, as if everything I did mattered to him. It was strange because he had never paid so much attention to my actions before, and now every step I took under his gaze seemed important, as if he were trying to understand me through every motion. It became hard to breathe. I tried to ignore him, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. Every word, every glance sparked a multitude of questions in my mind, questions for which I had no answers. I didn't understand what was happening between us. Why was he so close? Why was he watching every movement I made? I felt my heart begin to race. I couldn't stay calm anymore, and I needed to say something. "Ben, what do you want?" The words slipped out on their own. I immediately regretted saying them, but I couldn't take them back. He froze, his gaze deepening, as if he understood I was on the edge of something, but didn't know how to help. He smiled, as always, but there was something different in that smile, something that made me feel vulnerable, as if I had suddenly become too transparent for him. "You think I want something?" His question was innocent, but in his voice was such certainty that it made it hard for me to breathe. I couldn't believe this was happening, that he could see into my thoughts, into my feelings, things I hadn't wanted to admit to myself. I looked away and returned to my work, but the tension in the air didn't dissipate. On the contrary, it only grew. And every time I met his gaze, I felt myself losing myself more and more. Several days passed, and I noticed that every time Ben appeared in the room, it became harder for me to breathe. His presence had become almost tangible, as though he had filled every corner of my space. I tried to avoid him, to keep my distance, but more and more often he was nearby. In the kitchen, the living room, the hallway. His words were becoming more insistent, and in his gaze, I began to sense something I found hard to interpret. Ben had become like an invisible force, gradually consuming my attention. I couldn't understand what was happening between us. When he appeared, I felt a strange tension that was impossible to ignore, and although he continued to behave calmly, every movement, every glance seemed to penetrate me, making me feel like I was on the brink of something I should never have crossed. One day while I was sitting in the living room, absorbed in a book, I felt that he was there again. I didn't hear his footsteps, but I felt the air change. I looked up and met his gaze. He was standing right by the door, motionless. I felt that familiar sensation in my chest, cold, but unavoidable. He was looking at me, and there was something in his eyes I couldn't understand, but it made me feel like I was no longer in control of what was happening. It became hard to stay calm. I tried to distract myself by returning to my book, but it was impossible. He was too close, and his presence pressed on me like an invisible wall. I could feel his gaze sinking into me, as if he were reading every thought in my mind. When I looked up again, he was still standing there, motionless, but now his face was more serious. He remained silent, but his gaze spoke louder than words. I couldn't understand what he wanted to say, but I felt how the silence filled the air. He didn't look away. It became unbearably hard to stay seated. I stood up, feeling how my legs grew heavy. For some reason, it seemed like I couldn't step away from him. I couldn't breathe, and it was no longer just strange. It was frightening. You can't stay within these boundaries for long. His voice broke through the silence. It was spoken calmly, but his words felt like a sharp blow to my thoughts. He wasn't waiting for a response. His eyes were full of the certainty that I would understand what he meant. I tried to say something, but in that moment, I lacked the words. Something inside me resisted, but something else, something stronger and more dangerous, pushed me toward this inevitable moment. I didn't know what to do or how to react. This was the first moment I realized that I could no longer control the situation. I stood before him, feeling how his presence filled every cell of my body. Everything around us vanished. I didn't know where I ended and where we both began. When I tried to step away, to regain even a little of my space, he approached me. He was so close that I could feel his breath. All I wanted was to step back, but my legs wouldn't obey me. He was standing next to me, and for a moment I thought I could no longer breathe. We stood there in complete silence, and all I could feel was how his gaze penetrated me. I knew that in that moment, I should have told him to leave, to stop this awkward game. But something inside me stopped me from doing that. I couldn't understand why I felt drawn to him. It was wrong. But still, I couldn't stop. Every day with Ben was becoming harder, as though I was gradually losing control over myself, over my thoughts and feelings. He kept being around. His presence had become almost unbearable. I couldn't pull away from him, and with each passing day, the distance between us shrank. It was as if he had seeped into my inner world, making me feel that everything I did was no longer truly mine. He was everywhere, in my thoughts, in how I moved, in what I said. I tried to return to my normal life, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed forever. One evening, as I sat on the sofa looking out the window, my thoughts once again returned to him. I couldn't ignore the strange cold I felt whenever he was near. He was here, in the house, but it felt as though his shadow had already claimed every corner. I heard his footsteps and immediately knew he was close again. He entered the room, and I felt the air grow thick. I couldn't look at him, couldn't meet his eyes. But he still came closer. The silence between us was like an invisible wall, one that couldn't be broken. I didn't know what to do. All I wanted was to stop this moment, but I couldn't move. We stood across from each other, and it felt as though time had stopped. I couldn't breathe, couldn't find the words to push him away, to ask him to leave. And then, suddenly, he spoke. His voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made me tense. "You can't keep going on like this." His words weren't a threat, but they carried a weight. I felt it become harder to stand. He stepped closer, and I couldn't retreat. His eyes, his face, his breath, all of it became a part of me, a part of this moment that I could no longer control. "Ben, please," I exhaled, my voice barely audible. I felt as though I should stop this, but something inside me, something I couldn't control, was pulling me forward. I felt a tightening pain in my chest, my heart pounding, but at the same time I couldn't step away. He was right there again, and his gaze was so insistent that I could no longer tear myself away from it. He moved even closer, and I realized I could no longer leave. Everything I had ever tried to hold back was collapsing right before my eyes. And in that moment, when he leaned in, when his breath touched my skin, I felt how this moment became something inevitable. When his lips touched mine, I couldn't hold back. At first it felt like a mistake, like an accident, but with each passing second, I felt this moment, this kiss, becoming something more. I couldn't stop. We both knew it wasn't just a mistake, but something more than we could allow ourselves. I tried to find the strength to push him away, to bring everything back, but it was too late. My thoughts scattered, and all the feelings I had tried to suppress now filled me completely. I couldn't think anymore, couldn't doubt. This moment was too powerful to stop. When we pulled apart, I stood before him, feeling completely empty. I knew that everything we had just experienced had become not only a mistake but a crossing, one from which there would be no return. We stood in silence, and I knew that now there would be no going back for either of us. With each passing day, the tension between us became more palpable. I could no longer hide this feeling, it was too strong and so unplanned. When I walked around the house, it felt as if the entire world had shrunk to just one person. Ben and I avoided talking about what had happened, but it was impossible to ignore. He was always there, and I felt his presence constantly. We were silent, but something else had already formed between us, something that couldn't be erased by words or time. This feeling, like a shadow, followed us, enveloping every movement, every word. I tried to focus on John, on making sure he didn't notice the changes in our home, in the atmosphere. But as soon as I was alone with Ben, that same coldness overtook me, one I couldn't explain. I couldn't control what was happening between us anymore, and it was becoming more and more dangerous. Every word Ben said, every glance, even silence, it all seemed to affect me. He knew what I was feeling, and I knew he knew. He didn't try to hide his intentions, even though he never spoke of them. Everything happened through his eyes, through those silent moments, through the way he approached me, the way he stood beside me. There was an insistence in his behavior that pushed me toward actions I had never even considered. One evening, after yet another drawn-out silence, I felt his presence fill the room. We were both quiet, and I realized that this moment couldn't continue like this. All I wanted was to stop the tension, to find a way to set everything back in its place. But I couldn't. "What are we going to do about this?" I said the words aloud, almost breaking down, but holding back the anxiety that was swelling within me with each passing second. He looked at me, and in his eyes there was such certainty, as if he already knew the answer to that question. His gaze was calm, but filled with the knowledge that something had changed. He didn't answer immediately, but his silence spoke more loudly than any words. He stood there, and it seemed as though this moment should end, but I didn't know how. We stood in complete silence, and I felt my thoughts circling around that question, like an uneasy shadow, not allowing me peace. I couldn't go on like this. I couldn't allow myself to, but at the same time, something inside me pulled me back to that moment, to those eyes, to that gaze that had already become a part of me. "We need to decide what to do next," he said at last, his voice calm. but there was an inevitability in it. "We need to end this," I exhaled, more to myself than to him. I realized I couldn't hide from this truth anymore. My words hung in the air, and although I tried to sound decisive, inside I was wavering. I understood that perhaps this was the only right decision, but it didn't ease the heaviness in my heart. I was afraid of what would happen next, but even more, I was afraid of remaining in this state of uncertainty where we were both stuck in place. "You're right," he said, and I felt the tension that had hung between us for so long begin to recede. But it didn't disappear. It was still there, lingering. We both understood that now, having taken this step, we needed to sever ties so we wouldn't lose any more. We both knew that no decision could bring us back to the moment when everything was how it was supposed to be. I looked at him, and everything inside me felt empty. We stood at the crossroads of this moment, ready to say goodbye not only to each other, but also to the versions of ourselves we once were. We both understood that nothing would ever be the same again, and that now, this chapter of our lives was closed forever.